Shalom to our audience and to our special guest today, Professor Marinus van-Aijendorn of Leiden University in the Netherlands. I am Sgיא-Sורץ, Professor of Psychology and Director of the Center for the Study of Child Development at the University of חיפה. It is a great day for the University of חיפה community to host Professor Marinus van-Aijendorn, who is being awarded an honorary doctorate for his long-standing distinguished achievements and for continued friendship with many scientists at the University of חיפה. Thanks to his exemplary achievements, Professor van-Aijendorn was granted in the year 2004 the Spinoza Award, the most distinguished scientific award in the Netherlands and comparable to the Israeli Prize. And then in 2007, he also received from the Society for Research in Child Development an award for distinguished international contributions to the field of child development. Professor van-Aijendorn is a permanent fellow at the Dutch Royal Academy for the Sciences and Arts. For almost 2 decades, Professor van-Aijendorn has been dedicated to study the effects of the Holocaust on survivors and their offspring. His research on this important topic is in close collaboration with researchers at the Center for the Study of Child Development at the University of חיפה. The Holocaust is going to be the central theme of our program today. Welcome, Marinus, to Israel and to חיפה. My colleague, Professor David Oppenheim, will join me in interviewing Professor van-Aijendorn. Professor Oppenheim is on the faculty of the Department of Psychology and a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Child Development at חיפה University. David, I would like to invite you to raise the first question.
It's a pleasure to have you with us today, Marinus. And you know, most of us as researchers, we have personal stories, motivations that draw us into a certain domain of research. And perhaps we can open by asking you some of the motivations that have led you to study this issue of the Holocaust.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me here to give this interview, and for in general the privilege to be here and to receive this highest award of your university. I'm really very unexpectedly this recipient, and very glad about the events that evolved from there. It's very difficult to really know what your personal motivation is, and in fact this is the first time that I'm talking about motives of a personal nature in any type of research that I'm doing. Holocaust research is only one part of my research program, but certainly the most intriguing part in the personal sense. What kind of personal involvement is at stake here? It's what I'm wondering myself very often. First of all, I have to really admit, without my colleague Avi Sgיא, I would never have entered this area of research. That's absolutely clear. It was the immediate reason to go into this very difficult domain of the consequences, psychosocial consequences of surviving the Holocaust. And it was especially his personal story about the Holocaust that made me aware of the relevance and the relevance even up until today of what had happened to his mother. He told me, met him for a somewhat longer period of time in Belgium, where his mother had lived before the war in Antwerp. He told me how she survived the war as a child Holocaust survivor in a way, survived by, as soon as the Nazis entered into Belgium, fleeing to France with the family, losing her parents who perished in death camps in Germany, and herself with her sister went into hiding in a monastery in France. And after the war, immigrated into Israel. created a family. Avi was her son. He became a father, and his offspring, his daughters, are having children now. So he's a grandparent, and one of those intriguing personalities who, in a way, are second-generation Holocaust survivors. And what intrigued me was, where do people get this courage from, this motivation to begin a new life, a new family, after having experienced these atrocious events during the Second World War, like his mother had done. I think that's a wonderful example of human resilience, and I was intrigued by that resilience. What was happening in the after the Second World War that made it possible for Avi to develop his family, his career and his personality out of a family context which was really horrible in a way, with so many traumatic experiences in the past of his mother. So I'm quite certain that the most important direct immediate reason for embarking on studies in this domain of the Holocaust derived from this personal story of Avi. But I should also mention that I really think it was fruitful soil for that story in my experiences before meeting with Avi Sagi. And I think what we all know is that in Holland the Holocaust, the Nazi occupation of Holland is very vivid still, up until 2008. There's still yearly a commemoration on the 4th of May of all the victims of the Second World War. At my university, there is still every year a special lecture, Cleveringa lecture it's called, after the person, Professor Cleveringa, a professor in law, who was the first professor at any university in Holland, and maybe worldwide, who openly protested the expelling of Jewish professors from Leiden University about 41, 42. He protested with a very moving address to the university community at Leiden, and as a consequence of that, the University of Leiden closed down as out of protest against what had happened or what threatened to happen with the Jewish colleagues. And I think that it's wonderful that that type of courage was displayed at that point in time, and that it is still commemorated in Holland in several ways. Another, I think, important issue is that in 41, I think, the only strike took place in Amsterdam of workers, blue-collar workers, a strike out of protest against the Nazi occupation of discriminating and expelling Jewish workers out of their jobs, which was unprecedented. At least that's what historians are telling me. So in Holland, the Nazi occupation and the Holocaust still are very vivid in our minds. Even up to the point maybe that the resistance against the occupation and against the expelling of the Jewish colleagues and friends reaches the level of a myth, a mythical proportion. Because, and that's the other side of the coin, in Holland the number in percentages of Jewish citizens, Dutch Jewish people, that have been exterminated in the death camps in Germany and Poland is really much higher than in many other countries like Belgium and France. And I think this is called the Dutch paradox. On the one hand, The idea that so many protests went on at the University of Leiden, in Amsterdam, in the Jordan. Many Jewish people lived and their non-Jewish colleagues protested through a strike. Many Jewish children survived in hiding, hidden by Dutch non-Jewish citizens. Nevertheless, so many Jews were expelled and exterminated. And this is a paradox that we still don't know exactly what is at stake. And one of the explanations from an historical perspective is that Holland is a very small, very crowded country, and the geography of Holland is not very well equipped or situated in a sense that it's easy to hide people and all that. That might be one of the reasons. And another reason, also mentioned in the historical treatises about the Holocaust, might be the bureaucracy in Holland. A very strong bureaucracy, and every single Jewish person was registered, and these registrations were openly accessible for the German occupants. So the Nazis took advantage of the precision with which the citizens in Holland were registered. So might be reasons to expect, especially in Holland, a high number of Jews, Dutch citizens who were exterminated. But still, I felt and still feeling uncomfortable about it. And more historical documents now emerge that show that there surely have been a very strong resistance movement in Holland. But it's not that numerous in terms of the number of people involved in really active resistance. Very powerful small groups of communists and of very strict religious Protestant people went into active resistance against the Germans. But the grey majority, so to say, seemed to be not really that courageous or didn't feel the motive. Or I don't know why. Didn't feel like they had to make a stance against the Nazis. They were opposed to the Nazis. Only a small minority on the other side of the dimension, NSB'ers, National Socialists of the Dutch origin, that were actively helping the Nazis in the occupation of Holland. But the largest number of people just didn't seem to really bother about the whole occupation, or at least not about, especially the Jews were the victims of this occupation, and that's an intriguing, I think, issue for me. Has been and has remained an intriguing issue, and it has also a personal side to it, because my grandparents from my mother's side were in the blacksmith type of business, from my father's side in the farming business. They were not politically active. They were not intellectuals, so they didn't read around in political books or historical treatises about National Socialism. They just wanted to survive the Second World War. They belonged to a minority group of strict Catholics. They were a minority group in the center of the country. So they adhered quite strictly to all the rituals, but also all the guidelines that they got from Rome, from the Roman Catholic clergy. And I think one of the real problematic issues in their lives has been that the Roman Catholic Church didn't make this strong stance against Nazism to motivate this type of individuals, like my grandparents of both sides, to take active stance against the occupation. So I think that's one of the reasons. They were obeying higher orders, so to say, and these higher orders were not to take active stance against the Nazis, because Rome suspected that if there would be active resistance from the Catholic Church, the domination, or the church itself would be at stake. Hitler would go for the church and would try and make it a powerless organization. We know of many examples that Catholics, like the example of the nuns in the monastery that were hiding your mother, the Catholics took a strong, active, resistant stance, but the majority of the Catholics didn't, whereas the majority of a very strict religious Protestant group did take a very active stance, did do a lot in resistance. So the grey, large majority in Holland did not take any steps. My father and my mother both were in their 20s during the Second World War. And they always have been complaining that they lost their youth during the Second World War. They felt bound by strict regulations from their parents. They wouldn't have any interaction with the German occupation. Life came to a standstill, so to say, for them. That's what my mother often complained about, that her youth, the years that she could go out and date and all that, went by without having any chance to do that. And after the war, they married, got children, and you know, business as usual. No time for going out and partying. So that was the major. But what they did in the war was trying to support, to help their parents to survive, to get sufficient food, they had many sips, to care for the siblings, with the older kids. And they did not actively resist the German occupation. And the other side of the coin is, would I, myself as a person, would I have been active in the Second World War? Would I have been in their position? I have my doubts. With hindsight, the wisdom of hindsight, you might expect it to be, but I think that's wishful thinking. It's I think so much easier to fall into the trap of the great large minority and be silent about things that are happening around you. And I was intrigued by the question, what makes the crucial difference? When are people going into a fight, be active, try and save lives of their human, the other citizens, ethnic minorities, or and when are they accommodating to what is happening around them? So that's the psychological question, and the moral. Where is the moral courage coming from? That has been intriguing me for quite a long time.
I'm sure that our audience will appreciate your detailed and sincere, reflection on the history in the Netherlands and your personal experience. And we would like now to move into a different direction, but something that might, explain further what you are trying to describe, is to talk about the scientific relevance of looking at Holocaust-related issues.
The scientific relevance is of course large in the sense that the Holocaust is a unique period. Hopefully, will remain forever unique. And the scientific issues that arise from that experience have been, I think, summarized quite well by persons like Adorno and Horkheimer. Habermas. Never Auschwitz again is their statement. This is the group of philosophers and sociologists of the Frankfurter Schule who fled to the United States before the start of the World War II, and who tried to make sense out of what was happening in Germany, the majority there voting for Hitler, in fact. And they came up with this concept of the authoritarian personality. The idea that the average citizen in Germany was raised in an authoritarian family context, with a dominating father and a mother that was always protective, kind of a screen between the father and the children, setting limits without any reasoning, just forbid or allow children to take some action. So the authoritarian personality was their idea of the origin of this grey majority in Germany to vote for Hitler, to vote for the Nazi regime. And it was strongly connected to child rearing, to family life, to psychological factors. And I think in a way they started a very promising, scientifically very promising line of research, but it didn't end up with any definite answer to the question, where does it come from that people are going with a large majority without thinking so much? Because it is a psychological, purely psychological explanation that they came up with. And I think we need other dimensions to really understand what's going on, and then see whether we could contribute from our perspective. And what I was struck with in reading around in psychology, looking for explanations of what happened in the Second World War, were the experiments by Stanley Milgram and by Zimbardo. Stanley Milgram, a very famous experiment with electroshocks, of course in a laboratory setting, artificial, but he forced people to really, so to say, kill participants in that research by electroshocking them through an intricate setup of an experiment in which, in fact, on the authority of the experimenter, the subjects were, in fact, felt themselves forced, urged to sacrifice another human being, torturing another human being, and eventually, in fact, killing another people with electroshocks of more than 220 voltage. And I always looked in the literature for the small set of people who resisted that temptation and that pressure of the scientists who pushed them to do what they didn't want to do, because they really felt it was awful what they did, but they did it. And I never came up with a decent explanation, because in fact, Stanley Milgram, I think, feels that there is really so small a minority that disobeys in that setting that he created, that it's the social context much more than personality factors that determine what type of action, disobedience or obedience, is going to be taken. And the same seems to be the outcome of this famous Zimbardo prison experiment. That was an experiment really so intriguing, because what he did was, Zimbardo, select very healthy, balanced, personality-wise students, Yale students, and he divided them randomly to a set of people who would play the role of prisoners and a set of people who would play the role of guards in a prison-like setting. It was a kind of a natural laboratory that he created. And he had to break off this experiment, because within 2 or 3 days, almost real torturing went on, physical torturing, and before that, emotional torturing of the guards, by the guards of the prisoners. Totally normal students, intelligent, personality-wise balanced, well-educated. Nevertheless, if you bring them in a certain social context, they seem to be able to do whatever it takes to suppress a helpless minority group. What kind of psychological factors on the individual level are present here? I never read about who was desisting most firmly as a guard against this type of treatment and as a prisoner. Would that be a certain personality? Would that be a person who has been raised in a certain way? I never came across any determinative factor, and that remained intriguing me. And I think the search for the moral core, or maybe the social-emotional core of a person that is able to resist, even in that type of social context, is one of the most important searches that we should have as social behavioral scientists. But up until now, it's really difficult to answer that question.
So this line of research on the Holocaust raises so many interesting scientific questions, like you pointed out, personality, context, and so on. But it also has broader implications for social importance, for the social relevance of this. And can you speak a little bit about that issue?
Well, unfortunately, I think even more significant than for the scientific debate is the policy and the social relevance of this type of studies. And I don't mean only behavioral studies. I mean studies of the Holocaust in general, historical, sociology, all kinds of approaches are, I think, of the utmost importance to get a little more of an understanding of what went on, and not to say the least about novels to be written about the Holocaust and pre-Holocaust period that might provide much more insight even than science might do. Remember that Amos Oz' recent autobiography really revealed a lot to me, at least, about what went on pre-Holocaust in Eastern European countries. The gradual suppression of the Jews, the isolation, in fact, the starting out of the sequential traumatization that Keilson used as a concept to describe what went on in the Holocaust. It's not only what happened within that small period of time, that 5-year period of time during the Holocaust. It's also what went on before that, isolation of a group, only because of it, of a racial issue, and afterwards too. But we might discuss that somewhat later. I think so. Many disciplines and art, literature, can throw a lot of light on this type of issues. But from our perspective, unfortunately, still there is genocides going on out there. We have, as Dutch people, very closely experienced the drama, the disaster in Bosnia. Just, what was it, 7 years ago or something? Really a very bad event, and it will become some kind of a national trauma in Holland, in a way that we were not able to prevent the genocidal processes that went on over there. Another, of course, very atrocious example is Rwanda a couple of years ago. And recently, we have now visiting our department in Leyden a student, a PhD student from Kenya. And Kenya was just on the edge of having tribal, ethnic conflicts driven up to a point that killings would go on in the beginning of this year, only because of some impact that some politicians had, and some maybe also fortuitously events. It was prevented to become really a disaster, but it was on the edge of becoming a disaster in Kenya. So there's always this chance, this risk of genocidal struggles are going on, and extermination of groups, minority groups, on the basis of race. And what I feel is important is to see whether there's still hope after. We as behavioral scientists cannot prevent, I think, that type of struggle, that type of fights, that type of extermination. But we might consider what we should do in terms of making the consequences a bit more acceptable or to cope with for the children and the children of the children. And I think that's why we might learn a lesson from the Holocaust. Apart from the fact that I think the Holocaust is a unique period in human history, and it should be commemorated. It should really be documented in all kinds of ways, and one of the ways is of course doing scientific studies, behavioral studies on the consequences up until 2008 of what happened at that point in time. It's so important, it's so shaping the collective mind in Holland, for example, but I think all across the world, that we should know more about it to learn a lesson from history and not only make always the same mistakes over and over again.
So, talking about the scientific basis for the Holocaust, for the effects of the Holocaust, you know, we know that many papers have been published, and there is a great deal of controversy, debates about the effects. Some people talk about very negative effects, but some people do not necessarily agree that there are effects. When you talk about first generation, and then you speak about the second generation, the third generation, could you tell us a little bit, more about your direct experience with existing research on the first generation, as well as your own research on the topic?
Well, first let me start with a case, a very famous case in Holland, but maybe not so widely known abroad, which is a case around the person of Ed van Tijn. He is a child survivor of the Holocaust. What he went through during the Second World War was, in fact, having to go into hiding. And he was 8 years of age at that point in time. He went into hiding at 40 different places because it was too dangerous to keep him in one place at the same time. He was a really Jewish-looking person. What he experienced, he luckily survived. What he experienced after the war was that his parents luckily survived as well, came back, but were totally destroyed in a way. They really were hopeless about all that they had seen happening in the concentration camps that they had been closed up in during the war. So they went through an atrocious time. And they got totally disturbed. They got into fights which they didn't understand each other anymore. They lived different lives. And this child, at that point in time, still a child, after the war I'm talking about, suffered immensely from what happened. Not only during the war with all those changes of places, but also after the war, getting back his parents, but in a state of mind that was really unrecognizable in terms of the type of personality that they were before the war. And the parents divorced in the end, and he was so disturbed at around 15 years of age that he went even in therapy, and at that time in electroshock therapy, and he suffered a lot from that as well. And what is intriguing is, so he suffered, he is an example of a first generation child survivor of the Holocaust, but he became very successful. He has been a Minister of Internal Affairs in Holland, a very important and powerful politician, and he was respected. He was not only a powerful politician, but he was an intellectual too. And he got his power from his intellectuality, his having widely read around and all that. He became the mayor of Amsterdam during a very critical period of that city. He was very respected in that role. And after the closure of all that, let's say, that offices that he took during his active lifetime, he became a writer, and he wrote a wonderful autobiography about what happened to him in the Second World War. And I think that's what happened to a lot of first generation Holocaust survivors. They were, on the one hand, I think they were really traumatized by what happened before, during and after World War II. They really had scars all over, had to go, many of them, into treatment, and still are showing signs of post-traumatic stress, lying awake during the night, dreaming about what happened in the past. But on the other hand, they were filled with a hardcore of resilience. He must be a very resilient person. He must have a lot of resources in himself to be able to even survive all that happened during those years, and become so a successful citizen of a country that did a lot of damage to him and his family in a way, because even he, I think, or also he would have the idea or the impression that Holland had been a little bit, or more than a little bit, passive during the Second World War, and could have been better in treating those who came back from these ordeals in the concentration camps to their own homes, to find these homes occupied by Dutch citizens who didn't want to go out. So sequential traumatization, even after the war was not ending. So I'm really thinking that he is a case to illustrate what we found in many studies, and also in our study, the study that Avi, his co-workers and I did together over a series of years, that what you find is in the first generation really strong effects, but contained effects of the Holocaust, contained to post-traumatic stress, still lying awake, thinking about the past, even 60 years after the end of the war. On the other hand, feeling capable of coping, and really being capable of coping with, for example, family matters, raising a family, raising a successful series of children, being good grandparents, being balanced in many, many ways, but feeling still inside the scars of what happened in the past. So I think, without any doubt, across many, many studies, including ours, well-conducted studies, the first generation effect is really, even after 60 years, is tremendously large, but contained. And that's why the second generation got a chance of a new start. And that's most intriguing, again, to all of us. I think you as well as me, but for me especially, because I'm not a second generation Holocaust survivor. I'm not feeling it from the inside. I'm really surprised about how well the second generation is functioning. Many studies, if you compare offspring, second generation offspring of Holocaust survivors with non-Holocaust survivors who were raised in Israel, who were born in Israel, raised in Israel, of parents who just before the Second World War immigrated into Israel, so didn't experience firsthand the Holocaust. There is, in fact, second generation, no difference in many studies, many domains of functioning, personality-wise, adaptation to work circumstances, in all kinds of contexts. No difference in post-traumatic stress, no difference in adult attachment representations, to use a concept from our own field, and that's intriguing. And the third generation also, no scars, at least up until now, being found. In the second generation, there's, I think, one potential exception to the rule, And that is that in some studies, not that large studies, small scale studies, and we have to look very closely at the evidence that these studies have been bringing us, that when second generation offspring is really threatened, life threatened, for example by a fatal illness like cancer, or by combat experiences. Two studies that indicate that second generation offspring is more vulnerable to negative responses to that kind of life-threatening experiences, although they themselves never experienced the Holocaust. But they might, of course, have picked out of the air an atmosphere of being hurt, being scarred in their parents, and have been carrying around that type of experience, that mental representation, have been able to function totally adequate in all kinds of circumstances, except when you are on very thin ice in terms of being exposed to really exceptional, dangerous situations like having cancer or having a combat experience with the life or death outcomes. So, and I think that we should, in the next stage, try and solidify whether really that type of, let's say, vulnerability is hidden below the surface. Maybe on the very basic neurobiological level, that only come to the surface when you're really stressed by certain conditions. I don't know. That we really should try and sort it out. It's important because we should not conclude that second generation traumatization does not exist if there's any chance that it does exist, but we didn't look carefully enough. So I think we really are responsible for the conclusions also when they are negative.
It looks as if you have an optimistic view of second generation and third generation anyway, despite these exceptions, and that with the first generation we see problems and negative consequences, but still, when you go to the second and third generation, which is quite fast, you know, talking about, you know, if we count back, you know, to the post-war situation when survivors brought their families, that second generation do not necessarily have effects. And you talk about resilience, you use the term resilience. And you are very kind, you know, to refer to my personal issue, my personal experience, and you may know that David too, you know, has a Holocaust background in his family, quite bad. I know the story. And here, you know, we are, two professors of psychology interviewing another professor, a colleague from the Netherlands, and we managed to do it. You said, you know, that, you know, despite, you know, the difficulty of our parents who really had, you know, very, very difficult life, second generation is doing very well. And we have many, many examples of this kind, and we are very happy, you know, that we could be here today and interview you. Could you elaborate more on this concept of resilience in this context?
It's a very complicated question, of course, because and I don't know the answer. Just to be, you know, coming straight out with the answer, I don't know the answer. I think a few factors might have been very important. The first is that you have to have a close look at the type of traumatization of the first generation, because they have been able to compartmentalize, to set those experiences apart, building up a new family. And I think one of the differences with trauma, for example, as a consequence of child maltreatment, child abuse, is that things that happened, awful things that happened to the first generation, were not inflicted upon them by trusted persons like their own parents or their broader family. So there is a depersonalization of the trauma, basically, at least in most cases. At least that's what I speculate. And because of the depersonalized type of traumatization, it might be easier, have been easier for the first generation. It is, of course, enormously difficult, but it might have been a little bit more easy not to fall into the same trap of making life of your offspring, of your children, as awful as your own life has been, like that what's happening with child maltreating parents who have been maltreated often in their own childhood. So they just reproduce what they themselves experienced. And that's not at stake here. The other issue is, I think, a very important, potentially very important issue is the social support system. Whatever, political view you have, of course, everybody can feel that to be in a country, to immigrate into a country like Israel, with many people having gone through the same kind of atrocious event in the Holocaust, that should have been a support system for them. Although I know there are historical records that even in Israel the climate was quite cold. They had a cold shoulder to those who went into the Holocaust like lambs to the slaughter. I think that's a grave mistake and a mistreatment of Holocaust survivors immigrating into Israel. But basically, I think it's totally different when you have to build up a new country, having a lot of people around you having gone through the same experiences. It's easier to look forward and not backwards. It's like Frankl argues that maybe many Holocaust survivors found ways to cope with the Holocaust, in fact, by denying, not really denying, setting it aside, going forward, living into the future, not into the past, because the future is more important than the past, because in the future your children and the children of your children have to make a living of their own, have to become happy, balanced adults. And you feel a responsibility for that. So that's why I think social support, being in an environment that is knowing what you went through, I think that has been a very important factor. And the last, and it's a very dangerous issue, I know, the last thing might be that there is some kind of a genetic component, that the most resilient survivors were those who were also having some kind of a, I don't know, genetic protection against the worst consequences of going through that kind of trauma. Because you would suppose if you go through such a trauma, you're totally disturbed as a person, disordered, and it's not the case. So might be a hardcore in terms of the genetics, and there are a few studies that show that there might be genetic protections against traumatized memories. There's a very recent study published in Science about Rwandan survivors from the Rwanda genocide, showing that some of them are surviving because of having a certain polymorphism that makes them less vulnerable for traumatic memories, and it might be similar in a way, although the analogy is totally should not be made, but just from a scientific point of view, it may be the same with severely maltreated children. Not all severely maltreated children, I'm going to talk about it tonight a bit, not all severely traumatized children of child maltreating parents have a lot of scars. They can become very well functioning, and one of the major factors that seem to protect them is their genetic makeup. And I could go into details about that, but it's research done by Avsalon Caspi and Terry Moffat and their group. And so I think there might have been a hardcore too in terms of genetics, although I know it's a very difficult topic, because genetics, of course, have a very bad reputation, and correctly so, especially because of the Holocaust.
It's very fascinating, and a lot of questions are coming up from what you're saying, and a lot of conclusions that are somewhat counterintuitive and leading the way to... I'm thinking about what you mentioned earlier about the second generation findings, which are not always intuitive, and the new directions for research that you are pointing out now, just now, very fascinating. In kind of moving to a closure of our interview today, and of hearing about your interesting and provocative ideas, could you talk a little bit about the lessons from this line of thinking, this line of research, and it's really much broader than research. The lessons for science, other lessons that you might think about, research that might be instigated by some of these ideas, and other ideas, other thoughts about lessons from what we have talked about up till now.
Maybe we should differentiate between the scientific implications and what should be done next step, and the social implications potentially of this series of studies. I think in the scientific realm, it is really time to go beyond the surface now. I think we went a long way in addressing the issue of the consequences of traumatization, Holocaust traumatization, by using measures derived from attachment theory, which is a theory which is a well-founded theory with well-validated measures, observations, and all that. I think it's a very powerful theory to uncover any sign of traumatization in the second and in the third generation. That's exactly why Avi and I decided to go on that trajectory, because we thought there were new tools available, tools better than generation of research before us. Nevertheless, we didn't find differences in the second generation. Many in the first, not in the second generation. Now, what I think is that really we should go to a next level of complexity and look beyond the surface into, first of all, the stress reactivity system of Holocaust surviving second generation. So how is their potential traumatization, the tension in their families visible under threatening conditions, under stressful conditions, in the workings of their HPA axis, so to say, so the stress hormone system that produces the cortisol level. That is a very important index of hyper or hypoactivity of the stress system in human beings. It has been shown in animal studies that the stress system of second generation offspring or first generation traumatized, on the animal level, traumatized parents really show disturbed stress regulatory systems below the surface, and we have to go to that next step, I think, in research on the Holocaust.
Marinus, we are just approaching, I get science, the very end of our program, so
I
just one concluding sentence, please.
For me...
we could be here, for hours. I'm sure it's so excited to listen to you, but we have to...
I think, one thing is clear. We never should give up hope. I mean, I'm really flabbergasted by the resilience of the first, second, and third generation. Don't talk about a lost generation. If you talk about survivors of genocides, of catastrophes that still are happening, there is always hope, and the Holocaust is, I think, the icon of hope instead of the icon of, or also, of bad happenings, but it's also the icon of hope, and we should keep that in mind.
Thank you, Marinus, for your well-thought insights on the issue. And thank you, all of you, for being with us. Shalom.